Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to attend the Maple Heights School Board of Education meeting for February 22nd, 2021 at the Board of Education office at 5740 Lawn Avenue. The meeting is starting at 5:40. May we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Brown?
Present.
Ms. Bruce?
Here.
Mr. Garth? Ms. Roseman?
Here.
Ms. Moore?
Here. May we rise for the pledge of allegiance, please? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next on the agenda is the adoption of the agenda, the reading, the approval, and signing of the records of January 4th, 2021 organizational meeting, January 25th, 2021, a regular meeting, and January 28th, 2021, a special meeting. May I have a motion, please?
We'll make that adjustment before you do the official agenda.
I'm sorry, which is it?
You want to make that adjustment to the official agenda for this evening before we take it to a vote?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
You like me to announce it?
Okay, before we take a meeting for a motion for the approving of the minutes, we have an adjustment for the current agenda for tonight's meeting. I will let Dr. Keenan announce the corrections.
Thank you, Madam President. For this evening, under the agenda that was initially distributed, under C1, there's a recommendation for an employee, Miss Essie Parrish, that we'll be removing from the agenda this evening.
Okay, now we're referring back to our regular meeting. May we have a motion for the reading and approval and the signing of the records for the previous meetings that were read off and announced?
So moved.
May I have a second, please?
Second.
Is there any discussions? Seeing none, Mrs. Beverly, may you take a roll call, please?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Ms. Bruce?
Yes.
Ms. Roseman? Yes. Ms. Moore?
Yes, motion carries. Next on the agenda, we return the floor over to our financial report for from our treasurer, Mrs. Beverly.
I'm asking for approval of 6A 1 through 3, and I kind of wanted to go over my monthly financial report. And this is for the month of January. We're almost at the end of February, but for some reason we're really late in the month. So if you turn to page 3, this will show you our fiscal year. This will show us our fiscal year 21 revenue expenditure analysis. muted. Number one has our actual compared to the forecasted amount. And if you look at the blue, it shows you that we have a favorable impact on our cash balance of $1.6 million as of this point. If you go down to number two, in the gray part, you can see the January cash balance is $3.8 million more than it was at last January. And 1.6 million more than the forecasted amount. So we're doing pretty well watching our accounts and making sure we're being fiscally sound. Number three shows you the fiscal revenue shortfall or surplus based on the actual and estimated amount. And we have an operating surplus of $1.8 million at this point right now by the end of January. If you go to the second, or the next page, it shows you the monthly revenue analysis. Top line is January fiscal year 20, and then the bottom line is January 21. So we're a little ahead in January, which is kind of about almost $85,000 more compared to last year. One of the reasons is we had a little bit of money extra in our all other revenue due to the zero workers' comp rebates that we got back. So if you go down to number two, in the blue area, you can see the compared to the same period, the total revenues are $635,265 higher than they were last year, which is due to that workers' comp rebate, because we got about $565,000 from there. Then the next page shows you kind of the revenue and the impact of everything. It's in the green area, it shows you that we're $436,498 that we received more than what was forecasted. So we're pretty close to being on track from what was forecasted in October. And if you go to page number 6, this is where your expenditure analysis starts. Last year, we spent a little more. We're down $543,000 compared to where we were last year. So we've been saving pretty much in purchases, services, and all other expenditures, which is some of it's due to COVID, and we lose money into the ESSER money that we're getting. So it's but we're trying to keep track of everything that we're spending and being fiscally sound. Then when you get down a little further, number 2 in the orange or yellow box, compared to the same period, total expenditures are $1.6 million lower than the previous year. This pretty much totals out what we've changed over to spend of the ESSER money, which is the CARES Act money. So it's almost exactly to the penny. So we utilize COVID funds for some salary benefits, and then purchase services are down due to contracted services, transportation, and repairs. And then I just kind of go through each section of the forecast and shows you where we compare, where we stand. Everything is pretty much right on track with what we forecasted in the fall. This will be our new monthly financial statement so that you guys can see exactly where we're at, and you can kind of compare it to the forecast and what we've done. It'll give you a history of the prior year compared to now. And I just would like one year to be able to see that. So I think that was all I had, and just would like to get a recommendation to approve 6A1 through 3.
Our treasurer is asking for approval for 6A1 through 3. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Is there a second, please? Any discussions on any of the documentation that was reviewed or that is listed? Seeing none, I'm sorry.
Is this generated out of the software that you just got? Yes. Yes, I went through and put in all of our history, back 3 years. And then we kind of have compared everything just to make sure it matches the, 5-year forecast that has been submitted in the past. And then work our way forward until this is the first month that we actually have completed that we could use the financial software. Great, great.
Are there any more questions, please? Seeing none, Ms. Beverly, may we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Burns?
yes,
Ms. Roseman? Yes. Ms. Moore?
Yes, motion carries. Next, we'll turn the floor over to our superintendent, Dr. Keenan, for his report for tonight.
Thank you, Madam President, members of the board, Ms. Beverly, for my report for this evening. I'm going to start with 7A information. I've asked Mr. Scala, our data coordinator, come this evening and talk to you because we did receive our fall EOC data. And as the board has asked in the past, we'd like to share publicly the results of that data. Obviously, this is a very strange year to take a look at data from summative assessments. And it's not really a good comparison from year to year because of obviously the things that have gone on with COVID, but Mr. Scala's done a nice job of organizing and putting things together, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about the data that we put together.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks everyone for having me. Do I have screen sharing? I think I do. I do. Can everyone see that? Good. Okay, let me move this out of the way. All right. So like Charlie was saying, we just finished up fall EOC testing for the year. And like he said, there's a number of variables that are coming into play that make these comparisons somewhat problematic, but there's a number of subjects we can still do this on. So the first chart we're going to look at is just the percent proficient or above. So those are scoring either proficient, accelerated, or advanced. So on the y-axis here, it's just 0 to 100%, and you're just looking at the percentage of the population that again scored proficient or above. This is viewed over 3 years for each subject. So the blue bars here are the 18-19 year, the orange is 19-20, and then the gray is 2021. And then you have Algebra 1, Geometry, Biology, American History, Government, and ELA 2. Now, the only caveat I would say when looking at these numbers is there's been quite a change at the high school in which Algebra 1, Geometry, and ELA 2, how those courses are rolled out. They used to be purely kind of on the block, but now most of them are full year courses. So we can take a look at the data and compare to prior years, but it's not really so much of an apples to apples comparison. And we'll basically have to wait till the end of the year to get a full picture of what's going on with those subjects. Now for biology, American history, and government, those changes have not taken place. And a lot of those classes are on the block. And therefore the comparison is pretty good to make to prior years. So the way to read this as you're kind of looking at it was if you were looking at American history in the 18-19 fall year, we scored 42% of the population scored proficient or higher. In 19-20, it was 38%. And then this year for 2021, it was up at 48%. So you can see that for all subjects. Algebra 1 took kind of a dip here to 2% from 5%. But again, just keep in mind what I talked about the courses. Geometry, same dip, but a larger one from 17% to 2%. Biology, again, a dip from 54 to 38. But also keep in mind that 2 years ago, this is up about 9%. So it could be that that middle year for 19-20 is just a cohort effect, meaning we just had some really advanced kids come into biology courses for that fall. And again, in comparison 2 years ago, it's about 9% higher, so pretty good. American history, this is a 3-year high. Government, it's basically comparable, but again, a 3-year high. And again, ELA 2, just like Geometry and Algebra 1, again, the tested population is different based on how the courses have been developed. But we did see a pretty massive increase here with about 19%. So that's the overall when you're looking at the picture for this student populations that scored percent proficient or higher. Any questions about the overall? Okay, so we're going to go down and we're going to look at each subject, and we're going to look actually at their reporting category. So ELA 2 is first. Okay, so ELA 2 breaks out into 3 different areas. So you have informational text, literary text, and writing, and then this is the total. Now this percent is very different. This is not the percent proficient or higher. This is the actual average percent correct on the actual test. Now keep in mind for ELA 2 to score proficient, you need to at least get 44% of the test correct. So if there were 10 questions on the test, you need to get around 4 to 5 questions correct to actually achieve proficiency. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at these percentages. So for informational text, we see a nice linear incline here from 31% 2 years ago to 46% today. For literary text, it went from 44 up to 52. Writing has also steadily increased. And then obviously the total, which would be the combination of all 3, has also steadily increased. Now, again, keep in mind the composition of the students that took this test in the fall was a little bit more favorable for us. But on a side note for this, of the kids that actually were sitting in class that took this test this fall, for those that we identify as honors, 80% scored proficient or higher, which is really good for us. So I know what I said before with the comparison to prior years, but when I break it down to those that were actually sitting in the class that we really want to look at, not just retakes as well, 80% scored proficient or higher, which was really, really good. All right, so moving down to Algebra 1. So the reporting categories here are functions. It's called N, Q, E, and E, but that actually stands for numbers, quantities, equations, and expressions. Statistics, and then again, the total. So again, here going left to right, it went from 21% to 15%, now to 17%. So a little bit higher than last year, but lower than 2 years ago. For NQ, E, and E, that's been kind of a steady decline down, where statistics has been the opposite with a steady incline up. And then the total kind of a shift down, but pretty similar to the last year. This one being 19% accuracy on the test versus 20%. All right, moving down to geometry. So again, the categories here are circles, congruence and proof, probability and similarity and trig, and then the total. So again, circles moving from 10 up to 19%, so a pretty good incline. Congruence and proof, you kind of got an arrow shape here or an upside down V, where it moves up last year, but then moves down for this year. Probability, again, a sharper decline between last year and this year. And similarity to trig, a lot like congruence and proof, you see more of that upside down V, where it seems like we've returned to what we kind of saw 2 years ago. And the same thing with the total. Again, just kind of more like this V-like pattern. Any questions thus far? Okay. All right, so biology. Again, unlike ELA 2, Algebra 1, and Geometry, in which those courses have shifted, and therefore the comparison isn't the best. Biology, they have not, so these comparisons are pretty good. It's a similar population that was tested last year and the year before compared to this year. And in every way, what I see is kind of more of a V-like pattern across the board, from hereditary to evolution to diversity and interdependence life to cells, which are the 4 reporting categories, to obviously the total as well. I know, again, it's hard to read exactly what's going on in the numbers at this moment. It does seem like we may have experienced more of a cohort effect. And what I mean by that is last year, we may have just really got a pretty good set of students that performed abnormally well for our district historically. But the other comparison to kind of look at is just this year versus 2 years ago. And in almost every category and the total, we are higher than that as well. So I wouldn't just compare it to last year, as that can, sometimes you get just a good group of kids that come through that are exceptionally smart in the areas of biology and therefore outperform what we historically see. But instead, I would see that in the context of a 3-year comparison and still see us higher than 2 years ago. Any questions about that? Okay. Next, we have American history. American history, again, kind of seeing the same pattern, except it's a good V in the idea that we're seeing at least the same as 2 years ago, if not a little bit more. And that would seen only in the category of 1945 to present. It's up to 40% in comparison to 35 and 38. But overall, American history has stayed consistent over the last 3 years, even with the pandemic with us. And the final one is government. So government, there's founding documents, principles and structures, Ohio economy and policy, and then the total. For founding documents, we did see a 10% slip. So the high school does have the information over that to kind of maybe make some necessary corrections. Whereas principles and structures has basically stayed the same, a little lower than 2 years ago. And then Ohio economy and policy is almost the exact opposite of finding documents, where we saw a pretty large increase by 11% in that category. The total overall, though, is pretty similar to last year and a little bit lower than 2 years ago. You may also notice a little bit of a difference from what we saw up above with the percent proficient as they steadily increased. Last year was 50%, this year's 51. 2 years ago was 47%, and again, this year was again 51. But the difference here is they kind of just lowered the bar on the percent actually needed to get proficient or above. And that's what made that still an incline, even though we saw some lower scores. Overall, pretty comparable to last year and 2 years ago. All right, so any questions over the data presented over the fall EOC subjects?
John, I do have a question. Pretty much, if you're looking at all these graphs that you guys are showing us, the kids are either staying steady in some of these categories where they're not moving, based on some of the implementations that we have put in place over the last, I would say, last couple of years, or we're taking this huge dive in some of these practices. I don't know how long you've had these or how you're working with the curriculum department, but as far as these percentages, what are the actual process of what you guys are going to be doing or trying to implement to combat some of these borderline percentages where they're not moving or they're only moving, very slightly, or we're getting these big dives in some of this from this data?
So I'll respond to that. I think two things. The first thing is that, like John said to begin with, this is not an apples to apples comparison. This is a bunch of kids who sat through online learning. There's a big emphasis right now across the state in every district to talk about the learning loss that's taken place due to the COVID pandemic and the change in the way kids have been asked to learn and produce work. Regardless, we're still going to take a look at this data, have the BLT at the high school review and analyze by department. Like John had said here, like assuming government on the table there's 3 different areas where we need to analyze and see where we've had strengths, where we've had weaknesses, and what we need to do to make modifications to better hit the standards for our kids. One of the things that's a little difficult is, as John had mentioned, some of the results here are not apples to apples. For instance, in ELA 2, it looks like we made a huge gain in our proficient. But when you take into consideration that our honors kids took a semester-long class, and last year they did not. It's really viewing the data in a way that is misleading. So the high school team needs to kind of take a look at that, put it in context, and come up with strategies to get better for the second semester and for the full end year. And when we get those results from the end of the school year, that'll help us get an idea of where we need to make adjustments for each one of those subjects.
Okay. I mean, that's fine, Charlie, but I wanted to hear what John is doing as far as data wise, using the data that he's using in his position to work with Mr. Rousick and her team. I mean, because I mean, he's converting all of this information. I mean, I would like to hear some of his perspective for us as a board of how he's processing this at this time. I mean, if you don't mind, John.
Oh, yeah. So basically when these test results come out for AIR, they do give you a number level of different. The first thing I usually do is scrub the data so I can make the comparison a little bit better for the building and for the curriculum department. After that, I'll look at the individual student reports and I'll see what specific standard they're struggling in per student and hand that over to the curriculum department, especially in the earlier grades. Now, the only problem with that for subjects like government or biology or American history is the standards aren't very specific and built out, as in comparison to ELA, which gives you nice 10 standards. So I can tell you so-and-so who scored in the basic range and just below, let's say I'm looking at the raw score and they're like 2 points away, I can give over to the curriculum department, and I do, again, what standards that kid would have to work on to, again, get over the hump. It could be simply just, again, 1 or 2 questions away. And then math, which is the nicest in the idea of how much it breaks down to the actual standard, it can get very specific on the idea of, again, what's handed over to the curriculum department for them to make adjustments. So basically, after every test that comes out, I'll break down the data to the kind of standard level or the furthest that the assessment will allow me to go. From there, I'll kind of create like manifests based on where the kids currently are, who's kind of in line to maybe make that jump from like a 2 to a 3 or basic or proficient. And then again, what kids are really struggling. So you're like lowest 20%. And again, what specific areas they're struggling in. But that's, again, just over the assessment piece. There's a variety of other things I work on with the curriculum department to not only kind of wait for tests, but more on these secondary assessments we work on. These are usually in earlier grades. And that's when a student turns up kind of poor on a test, moving into further assessments to tell us more on the foundational side of reading or math, kind of what intervention would be specifically that they would need to kind of help them improve overall.
Does anyone else have any questions before I ask another question? You have any questions?
No, I will say, John, I do like the idea of like what you're kind of thinking about moving forward with the data pieces. I would just strongly encourage you to sit down with Ms. Jurassic and the curriculum department to kind of align some of those efforts, because if you're compiling all this data and then, the curriculum department is not encouraging staff to look at this data or do something about it, then it's kind of like futile efforts on your part. So I think that the data that you have, it's enough data to be actionable to figure out where we need to grow and look at some of the data that we have increased in and figure out which strategies did we use there. And let's just go ahead and start to implement those strategies across the board. So that way we have some consistency, and then that way we will be able to compare apples to apples. So I do think that you have a solid plan, but when we're talking about looking at individual students, then that means that individual students need to be supported, based off of their data and their plan. So I would just start there.
That sounds good. And so in response to that, just real quick, because again, we could talk about like all the things that occurred this year, but one really thing that, again, just Jalen, like what you're talking about, is at the very beginning of the year, all students are tested using MAP. And specifically what we're really looking at is your K-3 students, as that's part of our K-3 lit grade. When that occurs, all teachers eventually end up with these Google Sheets that I make that shows every kid in their class and then a breakdown of the score, not just the overall score, but every subscore within that. those are specifically tied, those scores, to secondary assessments. So let's say, for example, a kid shows up low on foundational skills, which are usually your foundational areas of reading. From there, they are automatically pushed into a second assessment, specifically called the PASS. It's over phonemic awareness that breaks out into 10 different categories. They're tested in each one of those categories. And the nice thing about PASS, it gives you 10 questions each. So it's not a hard test to give and it's pretty quick, but it may be things over like rhyme production or phoneme segmentation. From there, it's recorded what the scores are. And then I create thresholds. Like if you score 1 to 3, you're at a tier 3 intervention. If you're like 4 to 7, then you're a tier 2 intervention. If you're 8 to 10, you're good. And now move on to the next category. So all kids are worked on in the way, Jalen, you're talking about, especially what we're talking, when we're specifically referencing what we did this year with K to 3. And those are specifically tied to evidence-based interventions. So for example, again, a kid shows up in low and foundational skills, then they are given a PASS. The PASS comes up with rhyme production and let's say phoneme segmentation is the 2 biggest areas where that kid really needs to work on. You only start one at a time, but then they would jump into our iReady system, print off a pretty good intervention to work on with that student. That intervention is applied, and then progress monitoring does occur to make sure that those students move up to not only the yellow category of 4 to 7, but eventually get to green 8 to 10. So it does tie in the way, Jalen, you're talking about, because you're right. If I just sit here with these overhead numbers, again, saying that we've moved from 36 to 56 doesn't really tell a teacher much, because maybe they have 10 students that didn't move up at all. And therefore they need the specificity over why those students are moving. So yes, taking it down to the student level is very important. Our current system or methodology of communicating out to teachers just using our team drives through Google Drive has done well in trying to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Does anyone else have any questions before Dr. Keenan move on? All right, Dr. Keenan. Yeah, the floor is back to you.
Okay, thank you for my report for this evening. I'm making recommendations 7B, 1 through 3, 7C, 1 through 5 for your consideration.
Okay, Dr. Keenan is asking for board approval for 7B, 1 through 3, 7C, 1 through 5.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussions on the information that has been presented tonight?
I didn't hear you, I'm sorry.
I asked, was there any discussions on the information that was presented tonight?
No questions or anything like that. I just wanted to say congratulations to Mrs. Frances Costin for retirement. She was one of my teachers and she's served the district for 15 years. So I just wanted to say thank you to her and her service for our students.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Ms. Cruz,
Yes.
Ms. Roseman? Yes. Ms. Moore?
Yes, motion carries. Next on the agenda, we will have visitors participation. If there's anyone here that would like to address the board, please state your name, your address clearly so it can be recorded at this time.
Jalen, can you mute?
Okay, saying none. We're gonna go into executive session for a negotiation. No action will take place. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussions before we go into an executive session? Seeing none, Mrs. Beverly, would you take a roll call, please?
Ms. Cruz?
Yes.
Ms. Roseman? Yes. Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Ms. Moore?
Yes, motion carries. We are now in executive session.